Excellent. Okay, you're all welcome to this webinar. My name is Eunice Phillip, and I'll be co-moderating with Robbie Lawler today. And the aim for today is for us to come together and discuss in light of all this wake of all this aid courting, how we can start reimagining global health and the development of it, just so that we can actually enhance the capacity of these countries or these fathers left behind. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for giving up your afternoon. I'm also sit on the board of Irish Global Health Network, and they send their most thank you to all of you for being here today, and to our amazing speakers as well. So would we give people just a few more minutes if we have anybody else coming in, and then we'll just kickstart at exactly 17:04. So you can say hello to anybody in the background there while we're waiting the 1 minute. All right, so it's 17:04 on my end. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. So the goal today is for us to, like I said, to brainstorm ideas and listen to amazing speakers that are already working within this ecosystem of enhancing capacities and capability within the communities that has been affected. And this is not a new conversation. It's been there in the background, but this sudden court of hate has actually pushed this to the forefront. And while we are going to be discussing the capacity building and self-reliance, we cannot forget the amount of lives that these sudden aid cuts has affected. People not getting their medication, women not having access to maternity health, people not having access to it's very important that we have that at hand as we discussed all along. So I'm not going to keep you. I'm going to hand you over to Robbie, who's going to take this forward. And I hope you guys have a fantastic time and a mind-tingling webinar section. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. And I just want to take a second to congratulate Dr. Eunice Phillip on just completing her Viva and now having her PhD. And I know all the incredible work you've done to do that. And academia is just very lucky to have you, Eunice. So thank you. And so I don't know about all of you, but I was so looking forward to today. Firstly, because of all the great speakers we have in store for you, but also because I don't know about you, but sometimes when I just read and see and hear what's happening in the world, I feel so many simultaneous emotions. And a lot of it is disbelief, it's grief, and sometimes I can feed into the hopelessness. But I also just feel a great sense of anger, but also a real eagerness to make change. And for me, all the simultaneous emotion, and I know talking to many of you too, it can be so exhausting. It really is exhausting. But what really, really fuels my fire is when people come together to say no, that there is another way. And that's what we're here today. We're here to see what is the other way and how we can make this change together. We are standing up against inhumanity, and we are here to come together to fight for change. And that is what the Restore Humanity campaign is all about. We are a group of sufficiently pissed off people at Trump's disregard for lives and livelihoods, for science and health, for global economies and prosperity, and complete disregard for all things that are moral. So we have a counter movement, essentially. Everyone who is here today at a counter movement and all the other amazing campaign groups that's happening around the world. We lead with love, and that has been our campaign slogan from the very beginning, because when we boil it all down to what motivates us is love for people. It's knowing that every human life deserves a chance to thrive. And that is a fight worth fighting for. And I know when I talk to activists around the world, that really is the lifeblood of a movement. So the Restore Humanity campaign is a movement. It's a growing movement. We started off small, but we've had really good political engagement. And we are becoming more coordinated. Our coalition is growing and will continue to grow, hopefully. So I think there is a link going to be in the chat box to join. Currently, we are planning our next media press releases, our direct actions, our political engagements. So please join, and please bring your energies and your brilliance to any kind of streams of Restore Humanity campaign. As Eunice said, this webinar is also an important part of our strategy because it helps us come together, to learn together, to work together, and hopefully to have some fun together, because what's life without a bit of fun and a bit of joy, even through the darkness. And I know personally the people who work in global health or activism are the best people in the world, so we're all in very good company. So the agenda for today is quite simple. We're going to hear from each speaker, and Amanda, Christian, and Fanula, and then that's going to be followed up by a discussion. So this is quite informal. Please put any questions or thoughts you have for the speakers, or just general comments about what the speakers have said, in the chat box. And after the speakers, then we'll bring them forward and hopefully have a very constructive and brilliant conversation. So on that note, I have the absolute great pleasure of introducing Amanda Banda, an independent consultant with over 17 years of experience in health politics. So over to you, Amanda.
Mr. Miri, great. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this exciting, and also I like the way you've sort of like introduced a lot of angry, pissed off people, at the apparent lack of respect actually for humanity. So I would just like maybe to start off just giving an overview of some of the work that we're doing in Sub-Saharan Africa, at least primarily as a response to these funding cuts, engaging with actors in the region as well. And one of the things that strongly comes out, and that stream really stands out even a few months into this crisis, I think that for the majority of our leaders and decision makers as well, is that I do not yet think that the crisis and its implication and potential impact has sunk in yet. And the sense of urgency in terms of response, we're seeing it now, we're hearing it, but more less in action. So there's a lot of still more talk and less action in terms of, this is what we are going to do in response, and this is what we can do. But that's also really interesting in terms of really what's possible for the majority of governments in the region. So quite a number of colleagues and myself, actually, in the past few weeks, we've been digging into a lot of literature that's coming out and that's popping out there in terms of, what are some of the potentials. I think everybody now has become an expert. Everybody's throwing their solutions and ideas, which is great. I think we need such a convergence of a lot of different things, thoughts, reflections, anything that people think is valuable in terms of resolving this. So we've been sort of like going through a lot of that that's coming out, and trying to really dig what are the common issues, what are the key things that sort of like, emerging from all these online conversations and written papers as well that people have put out. And what's at stake, but also what is the reality. And so maybe I'm just going to highlight and just flag a few things just to spark our thoughts for reflection and also for conversation as well. The first one that I want to start with is actually the status of health financing on the continent, in terms of how well countries are doing, or maybe rather how not well countries are doing. I think just to flag that most of the countries are using 3 health financing indicators, if I may call it. I think one is benchmarking on how much they're spending per capita. And I think it's World Bank, if not WHO, that recommends $86 per capita for low-income countries. And at the moment, we only have about 10 countries on the continent that have made that benchmark. And if you look at the GDP spend benchmark, which is 5% of the GDP towards health, it's only one country that has made that benchmark, and that's South Africa. And if you look at the share of the national budget, which most countries had agreed 15% of the national budget should go towards health, of which also is contentious as a health financing indicator. There's a lot of debate around that, but it's politically known, so we still mention it for that reason. But I think that you still see that almost South Africa and one other country has met that indicator. And not to say that South Africa is doing well either, because there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of gaps and there's a lot of issues ongoing in the country at the moment. I think that as at the onset of this, we engaged with the African CDC, African Union, and very challenging as well as civil society to have a formal interaction with them. But we're getting traction now. I think we're getting there. But I think that lately what we have seen is that they have put out what they're calling an Africa's Health Financing in a New Era, which is supposed to be like a blueprint or sort of like a guiding concept paper that outlines some of the things that they think countries should be doing. But also embedding that in already existing structures and strategies around strengthening the public health institutions, around strengthening the health workforce, which is a big challenge. And I think one of the areas also that has been impacted amongst all the other, crises that faces the health workforce post-COVID. The issue of local manufacturing is also becoming prominent, and of course, increasing domestic financing in health is also becoming quite prominent in those conversations. But I've just highlighted the status at the moment, and we're not seeing that change even in the midst of the current crisis. And I think that some of us, or most of us, might be aware as well of the Lusaka agenda, which is also trying to, and I think maybe this comes in the future, thinking around, how do global health initiatives then converge and work together within the limited resources to align around country ownership. That's an emerging process that has been happening, and I think has concluded in the last year or so, where there's sort of like a consensus around, how global health actors and initiatives should be working in terms of supporting low-income countries. And I think just taking us back to the issue of lack of investments in health, why is that that most of the countries have not invested as much? It's not that they're not investing. It's not that they've entirely left the response to donors. I think that for majority of countries, I think we're looking at 40 to 60%, and in some countries higher overall of total health budgets are funded by ODA. And when you look at specific diseases, it actually boils down to some diseases as HIV, TB, and sometimes malaria, sometimes in a lot of countries can be 100% funded by donors. But when you look at the entire health sector, at least the proportion is actually much less in terms of donor funding, because most governments tend to spend on the health systems and other interventions, whereas the donors tend to focus on the disease-specific interventions. And so you're seeing that the pullout of aid is going to impact very specific diseases more harsher, but also, of course, the entire health system. And back to the question of why aren't countries doing enough? I think that we know actually the current architecture and sort of like framing of the economy, as we're calling it, that's unfair. I think we just need to call it that. I think that it's been ongoing conversations, I guess, for years and years and years, how the global economic architecture is unfair and is sort of like, shaped to favor other countries and not favor some of the countries. And as a result, of course, you're seeing things like debt popping up with quite a number of those countries unable actually to spend in the social sectors, not just health, but education, because they really, really are spending a lot of the resources on repaying debt and the interest as well. A number of countries are in high debt distress. And, when you look at where that debt is owed, actually, a lot of it is also private debt. It's not just that it's multilateral or bilateral. There's a lot of private debt, with a lot of it also owed to China, and of course, less some of the usual, health donors as the UK, the US, and European countries. And also multilateral wise, I think the World Bank is one of the hugest lender, as well as the regional banks, and also not forgetting the national debt as well that they owe at the local level. And then bilateral, you're also seeing quite a lot, China featuring at the top. And what's interesting on the bilateral as well is that most of the countries are not the usual suspects in global health that we're not engaging with as much. You have Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, you have the United Arab Emirates, and other, such countries than your typical usual suspects, that it becomes a conversation that we sort of like talking to we're not talking to the right target. I think that the issue of tax revenue, generation of tax revenue, is very contentious for a lot of countries, really, really dwindling economies, a lot of people in the informal sector. And where there is potential, I think you're looking at it in the private and in the business sector, of which there's a lot of challenges there, which include issues around illicit financial flows. There's a lot of issues around capital flight. There's a lot of issues that it's just really challenging for the continent in terms of tax administration and managing how they can better, potentially, earn extra resources from taxes, given that from the public, it's very limited base that you're looking at. And majority of the private sector, we know, again, what the challenges are there. And so while there's a slim chance of a potential there, it's also not one of the potentially biggest sources. And actually somebody last year, if not 2 years ago, looked at, what about if countries try to earmark specific taxes, which most of the countries are now, as we're engaging with them, are talking about earmarking certain specific taxes from specific either sin taxes, the health taxes, or other things. But actually, somebody did a mapping of what that looks like and where countries are at. But I think out of the 15 countries that were mapped, only one country, actually, Botswana, has actually earmarked and is actually raising, and you can actually point and track where that money is coming from and where it's going and how it's flowing into the health sector. For other countries, while they're talking about it, while they do say we are, earmarking XYZ tax for this particular health budget, there's not a trace and a track of what that looks like and the amounts and also the decisions around that. So that becomes really challenging, of which also we cannot compare to, it doesn't even begin to add up to the amount of resources, that we have lost. And so the feasibility of other innovative financing options, while it's there and something that we shouldn't dismiss, I think is something that we need to look at also with reality in mind, that, how much can this really raise in terms of filling in the gaps that have been dropped. I think private sector is becoming more prominent in the conversations, and also just to note that majority of African healthcare provision is also by private sector, but we know the challenges around that when it comes to reaching the most vulnerable populations. I think that they tend to leave out the most vulnerable populations. And while we can count on the private sector for innovation, and I think there's a lot of potential that should be explored in terms of innovation and digital health and a lot of other interventions that the private sector could play a role in. But the provision of services itself, I think most of us in global health, we know the gaps and the challenges, and we need to be cautious around where it comes provisional of service, unlike perhaps maybe other interventions that the private sector could play a role in. And I think for me, most of us have been working on access to pricing, access, the issues around accessibility and affordability, not just by individuals in accessing healthcare. I think is becoming real, and more so at a global level in terms of how much, countries are able to afford. And for me, I think looking forward, innovation is very key. And I think we need to really start thinking about what kind of innovative interventions will actually bridge that gap. For me, if I can see innovations that come that actually can demonstrate that we have reduced budget or need for a budget from, example, 10 billion to 5 billion, even less, I think that those are the type of interventions and innovations that we should be thinking about. And this is the time to really think hard of what could that be and what should that look like. I think that the continent is still at a very big disadvantage when it comes to access price for a lot of the commodities and a lot of the therapeutics as well, which is a big budget chunk. And I'm just looking at, how much of the ODA was going towards procurement of such products. And if price could go down way lower than what it is at the moment, I think that we would also see that as one avenue and one way of reducing, the budget burden, on countries. And that's something that I know that a lot of us and most of us continue to work on to really ensure, fair prices and access price to low income countries. And I think that for me, the issue of countries also being able to continue to mobilize and build the domestic resource base is still very critical, but we also need to be very realistic. I just mentioned from the start, the way our economic architecture is shaped, it really doesn't advantage most of the countries. And while some has the capacity and fiscal space perhaps to do more, I think they probably just need more political will. But we also need to recognize that there are countries that really cannot just do that. My country, Malawi, I think we are over 130% GDP debt ratio, if I'm not mistaken. Pretty much there's a lot of analysis and studies that have been done that say if we had to raise this tax and do this and combine all these interventions and options, how much money would we raise for the fiscal space for health? I think it showed that it could not even contribute to 17% of what we need. So look at some of those countries and look at some countries that perhaps South Africa, Nigeria, and maybe others could have more leg room in the economy to invest in health. I think we need to be very cautious of the differences and what that looks like, even as we're thinking about solutions. And so just to wrap up my main points at this point, I think that for me, the commitment of shared responsibility still stands strong. And I think we've seen the sort of like narrative is trending at the moment. And I think that the danger of more and more countries feeling comfortable because the US, the Netherlands, the UK is potentially thinking about it, the danger of more and more countries thinking if these leaders in global health can take such a bold decision, why can't we? I think that there's a real danger in there. And I think this is also where we need to focus our work to remind countries that, they committed to investing at least 0.7% of the GDP towards ODA, and therefore that commitment needs to stand, and we should not backtrack from that. And we should try to make sure that we, as much as we are engaging countries to do more and invest, we also really trying to make sure that there is that reality of a catastrophe and a disaster that could potentially happen if all countries pulled out at once, and also the danger of what that could look like if more and more countries decide to follow suit and make such decisions. So I think I just want to start with those reflections and thoughts, and we'll come back to it, and just leaving it to my colleagues as well to share their reflections and their perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was just really amazing. You've captured quite a lot in what you've said in just short time. And I think for me, the power dynamic, talking about how this reliance keeps going back in this cycle of poverty, reliance, and the level of debt ratio, that even if we want to push this forward, like, in the current economy that we have, that the debt ratio is quite high to actually make that much difference. So we will come back to you. I hope our participants are having all the questions written down to ask you quite a lot of questions. So we're going to just go ahead and move on to the next speaker. Fionnuala, we're going to move you forward. So Fionnuala is the head of global advocacy at Frontline AIDS, and we'll get to you then. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunice, and sincere thanks to the network for organising this and for having me. It's really appreciated. So as Eunice said, I work for Frontline AIDS, which is a global partnership of community and civil society organisations working together towards the shared goal of ending AIDS. And I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about how the US cuts have affected our work. So across our partnership today, there are 1.6 million people who face disruption to essential HIV services that they rely on to live. 27 organisations have been directly affected by the cuts out of 60 partners, but actually even partners who aren't in receipt of US funds are also reporting severe indirect impacts because of disruptions to key services, to the health system and supply chains. And the range of services affected is really expansive. So they include HIV and TB treatment, HIV prevention and sexual and reproductive health services, and specialised programmes for key populations, for adolescent girls and young women who are highly vulnerable to HIV in some settings. Also orphans and vulnerable children and survivors of gender-based violence. And we're also seeing that human rights and advocacy work are being really severely affected. Frontline AIDS as a partnership came together just over 30 years ago. We had our big birthday party last year, and we know from that experience over time that the HIV response began with the leadership of communities on the front line. And at this moment of crisis, we keep going by holding on to the belief that that is where the AIDS pandemic will end as well. But the situation out there is really undeniably bleak. And at Frontline AIDS, we are calling it a new AIDS emergency. There are a few different estimates around, but to share the estimates that have come from UNAIDS, the UN Joint Programme on AIDS, because of these cuts, an additional 6.3 million people will die of AIDS-related illnesses by the end of Trump's presidency. And that will leave an extra 3.4 million children orphaned and close to 9 million people who will acquire HIV when they wouldn't have before. And for anybody who saw the worst days of the AIDS pandemic, it's just heartbreaking and really unacceptable that we are in a position where we could be going back to numbers like that. And as in many areas of global health right now, the financial picture is really uncertain. You know, I talked about that number, 27 partners who've lost US funding, and you know, that's a loss of funding that has really happened overnight. And it's happening at a time when, you know, other bilateral donors are pulling out as well in growing numbers, and that's very alarming. And one of the big multilateral funders of the HIV response is the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria. And the fund until now has received 1/3 of its total financing from the US, and it's due to have a replenishment this year, and it's not yet clear whether it will get further funding from the US. So there's worse to come. And just over the last couple of days, I have also heard intelligence suggesting that Trump is also planning to use further executive orders to crack down on some of the big US-based philanthropic organizations, with a view to restricting their ability to grant overseas. And it's difficult to even imagine how devastating that will be on top of what we're already facing. So it's a really, really difficult time. But what does it mean for our theme of self-reliance today? I think that Amanda has already said about 95% of what I was going to say, and she said it brilliantly. So I'm going to try and on the hoof take out the bits that Amanda's already covered. But, you know, for me, I think one of the essential concepts that we need to explore when we're talking about this theme of self-reliance is national leadership. So I'm really glad that we're having this webinar today. And, you know, I really believe, and I've always believed from the beginning of my career, that what will sustain HIV and health responses is the financial and political leadership of national governments. And Amanda's interventions really underlined for me the vital role that civil society has to play in catalysing that leadership. And it was, you know, Amanda, really inspiring to hear from you about the work that you and others are doing to urge your governments to increase domestic resources for health, whether that is through progressive taxation or innovative financing or public-private partnerships, as well as the wider work you talked about around health systems and workforces and the supply chain. And I think as organisations that are based, you know, in Ireland, if that is where most of us are calling in from today, I think we really need to ask ourselves, what are we doing to support our civil society partners and implementers in different countries affected by the cuts, so that they can take on that work and they can join that movement, because it is potentially a really transformative movement, and it is the future. I want to say as well that, you know, civil society, as well as having a vital role to play in that advocacy piece, civil society is in itself an essential part of the health response, and a sustainable HIV or health response really has to have civil society and communities at the table, not in a tokenistic way, not to implement small programs here and there, but really as equal essential partners in delivering health services, in finding solutions to this crisis that we're in now, and in shaping the future of the HIV and health response. And that's something that's, you know, a core part of our model at Frontline AIDS. It's what we're all about. And so right now, when I'm talking to partners, one of the key things that I'm hearing from them are, firstly, about their advocacy on domestic financing issues, but also on the work that they're doing to try to make sure that civil society and communities are in the room when conversations are happening about the response to this crisis, and that they're there for the long haul, and that there really is recognition of their role in shaping the future. And one of the things that I really wanted to say in this space where we're talking about self-reliance is that nobody is alone right now. In times of crisis, you can feel really alone, but nobody is alone. I think that these elements that I'm seeing across our partnership, where people are not just doing the work in their national context, but they're sharing it with each other. They are talking about what's working. They are bringing proposals for shared advocacy to the table, and more they're actually doing advocacy together. And they're also talking about, you know, and Amanda again spoke about this, they're talking about how do you innovate in different ways in order to do more with less? What are some of the key innovations that you can use right now to sustain the most critical services? You know, I'm really seeing that exchange of ideas and knowledge and information and activism, all of which have been generated because of this crisis. And our motto as a partnership is together we're stronger. And I feel that really that should be everybody's motto right now. We are, when we think about self-reliance, we should also think about interdependence and how we can all support each other and learn from and benefit from one another in this moment. I want to come back to the national political leadership piece a little bit as well, to say that not only is it important for governments to put money into their health systems, but it's also really important for them to look at where our money is draining out. And, you know, we know in the HIV response, there are a lot of human rights and gender barriers to effective health service delivery. And now that countries may only have their own funding to rely on, will they finally face how wasteful it is to criminalise people living with HIV, for example, or key populations, or to put barriers in place for young people so they can't get HIV or SRH information or services? You know, these are incredibly difficult conversations. Even in Ireland, these have been difficult conversations and still are on some fronts. But again, I think civil society has a really critical role to play in asking those difficult questions and prompting that discussion in this moment of crisis. I want to be clear that it isn't just countries in the global south who have to ask themselves difficult questions. And again, Amanda, you covered it. But, you know, the piece around intellectual property restrictions and how they force countries to pay way more than they should for health technologies. You know, the impetus for keeping those rules in place comes from countries in the global north, and Ireland is very much among them. So when countries like ours say that they want to support country ownership or sustainability, we also need to challenge them on what they're going to do to address direct obstacles like IP barriers. And at the same time, you know, with the HIV response and so many other areas of health really in an incredibly difficult position at this time, there is no question, and Amanda, I think you've finished on this point as well, but, you know, there is no question that the path to sustainability will require evolving collaboration and steadfast support from governments. So here in Ireland and in other donor countries, we really need to work incredibly hard to defend our budget from our aid budget from far right attacks, because that will be really, really key. And we all have a role to play in that. So again, thank you to the network for mobilising the Restore Humanity campaign, which has really got that at its heart. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala. I was just furiously writing down notes on everything you were saying, and Amanda. What really struck out to me was nobody is alone, and your mantra, together we are stronger, and we couldn't agree more, and I believe that's why we're all here together. Some good news in all of the dark news that we see and we've heard. Ireland recently, just a couple of days ago, our Minister for International Development, Neil Richmond, not only said that we should keep our ODA budget as it is, but we should allocate more money to ODA. And so he's done talked to lots of the media about this. And I feel like this is something that we should really celebrate, actually, because we're not hearing this from any other country, other high-income country, really. So I think from the Restore Humanity campaign is that we really need to celebrate this and make sure that they uphold this commitment and make sure this isn't empty rhetoric. So I think that's something we should absolutely mobilise around. And although Ireland is a small country, we are strong diplomatically, and I feel that we really can lead by example and to overcome this far-right rhetoric, as you said, Fionnuala, and I think that's where the lead with love overcomes and trumps hate. So on that note, I want to open the floor to any questions, really, and I see one in the chat bar here, and it's from Rick Newsterin. Sorry if I got the name wrong there, Rick. But basically, it's about the Netherlands cutting 2.4 billion euros on development aid. And basically, the question is that development aid is now political. The heart of aid feels like it has gone. It's become a far-right talking tool. How do we overcome that, in your opinion? What has been working and what has not been working, and what can we learn from what's happening around the world? Anyone would like to take that? And I suppose while we think of this, I have another question to each of the speakers. What can we do here in Ireland? Because the Restore Humanity is based here, although we're working with our partners around. But what, from your point of view, can we do as a campaign to ensure and to help with transitioning of greater country self-reliance? What tangible things can we do and bring more strongly into this campaign? Amanda, would you like to take that? I'm going to be the bold teacher now. That one lies.
Yes, actually. I think for me, I think that one of the key things, I guess, is it's the narrative that's being shaped. And I like the name of the campaign. It's Restoring Humanity. And I think that in the current political context and context actually where there's a lot of polarization, and I think that we know that it's the trend again in most of the European context. There's that shift more to the far right. I think that having these critical conversations is very important, and I think also for me it's raising the awareness, because I keep saying that for most of the voters and most of the public and the population, which has a very strong influence actually in terms of, what decisions, governments could take. I think that really building the right mindset and the right thinking and the right narrative around these global issues is very important. And that's a very hard task to do, I can imagine. But I think it's worth pursuing, and also just to make sure that, just to congratulate the work that you're doing, because I know that it's not easy. But I think that's a very critical piece in terms of shaping that narrative, in terms of what looks like, because we're seeing, for example, in the US, and I think it might be the case for Ireland and maybe other countries as well, where once people become aware of, this is only how much money actually is going towards foreign aid, but also this is the context of where these countries are. We've sort of like trapped them in a disadvantaged position, where I think nobody wants to be helped perpetually forever. I think that it's the ambition and will of every sovereign country that they want to self-determine and to be self-reliant to a larger extent. But also, I think recognizing to what Fionnuala mentioned, that it's also about the ecosystem of shared humanity, and also nobody should be able also to operate alone. I think that there's beauty in how there's collaboration around certain investments and progressing in terms of certain interventions and investments that we make. And I think that solidarity is very important. And I think emphasizing that as part of, this is how we can restore humanity. But I think for me, the most critical piece is really making sure that people understand that you're asking countries to self-determine and to be self-reliant, and yet you're taking everything in their capacity to do that. And I think we're just seeing it again. And I think I was speaking in another webinar where I was saying, look, the tariffs are going to hit hard, a lot of our countries. And I think that for most sub-Saharan African countries, they've been asking for trade and not aid as much, because it's about, if we had fair trade, for example, would we need so much aid if there was a lot of fairness around this? And I think some of the things that I mentioned that are very structural and deep-rooted, that will take bold leadership across the board, in the global north and in the global south, collaboratively working together. And I think for me, that's the type of leadership that we need to instill, and maybe even build in terms of, I think that this is the inspiration of the type of leaders we need in global health, that will see the value, that will be bold enough, that will take the bold decisions that nobody has dared to take in history. This is what it's going to take to sort of like, reshape things. And while it's a disaster, what's happening right now, I think that there is also then that opportunity. But I have not seen anybody stepping up on both ends. And I think it's going to require that collaboration of, somebody in the global north really taking that bold leadership and saying, this is how it's going to be, and somebody in the global south saying, this is how it's going to be, and let's work together to transform and reconfigure what the future looks like, because we want to use this an opportunity to address, all the things that have not worked in the past, but also all the wrongs that are very systematic. Because as long as we're not addressing those structural issues, and the point of debt, somebody says, look, we had debt forgiven for a lot of countries about 25 or more years ago, and we're now back to square one, if not worse. Yes, we did that, but because the structures were not changed, you did that and retained the very same structures and the same inequalities. And as long as that's going to stay, I think we're not changing. So it's really a critical moment that I think we need to start calling for and putting out a vision of what that board leadership could look like and what that board leadership needs to do, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. In fact, that just nailed every belief that I have around this issue that is happening, this power dynamics of trying to give and that is as well retake again. And I think what you just said is actually echoing what Dressel did put in the chat, where he says that we need meetings where politicians participate for them to really understand the gravity of what exactly is going on. It's like you're giving somebody €5 and you're taking back 5.5. That person is constantly in that cycle or that will of trying to keep up with the debt as well, trying to be self-sustainable. So thank you so much for that. And on that, and just to piggyback on that as well, Nadine asked a question asking if you have any specific examples of a country and how they are responding on self-reliance. Maybe I'll have you take that and then we'll go to the second part of that question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so of course, I think there's quite a number of examples, and I think that, as I mentioned earlier as well, that I think it's the ambition and the will, I think, of a lot of the countries that they don't want to be perpetually reliant, and they really want to carve themselves out of this. But it sort of like feels like a trap, and I think we've talked about how that looks like. But I think in response to this current crisis, we've seen, for example, there's Ghana, where actually the Minister of Finance actually wrote a strong memo to the country's president to say, look, I think we need to release so much money. We need to fill in this gap. It's not enough, of course, but I think that this is something that needs to be done, and we need investments to flow. I think that, like I said, even if you're going to put out $10 million, to respond to a gap of $300 million. I think for me, that's bold already and showing good examples of what other countries could do despite the limited fiscal space that they have. I think that while I'm going to use South Africa as another example, I always say it's perhaps they have more leg room in the economy. I think it's a bigger economy, and they are able to do that. And so South Africa also came back with the response. What they did was analyze all the gaps that have been left, and sort of like what that looks like programmatically and financially, and sort of like come up with a plan of how they're going to meet that. But I say that with caution, that it's not a good example at the same time. While they're showing this is the type of leadership, this is the type of things we want to see, that has yet to be materialized. And I think activists and civil society in South Africa are engaging with the government and saying, okay, you said this, but where are you? Because you've now disappeared. You sort of like have not come back to your commitments of, this is how you're going to respond. My own country, Malawi, actually are just going under a budget process right now. And they managed to put up 0.03 additional budget as sort of like cushion, which is like it's pitiful when you look at it. But I think for me, I like the spirit of it, that they don't have much money. There is not fiscal space, like there's no room to squeeze anything else out of what's there. But it's the willingness to say, even if we're going to put out $1 million or $2 million in response to this, I think for us it's the thought and it's the idea. And perhaps that if we can push them more, I don't know where that money is going to come from, but I think if we can push them more and engage more, perhaps that's the direction that we need to be seeing. There's a lot of talk in a lot of countries as well around, of course, the issue now, at least at the Africa CDC level, has been pushed harder on local manufacturing. And I keep saying that's good ambition and very strong ambition. And I think that most of us have been engaging on the need for that, but again, we know that even if the therapeutics and commodities are manufactured on the continent, and there's need to build that capacity, and it's a very strong long-term strategy, but we know that countries will still need money to buy that, and so it doesn't also stop them from investing. And so there is slowly coming up a lot of thinking, and I think some countries are thinking actually efficiency. How do we even do more for less? And this has been a push, and a lot of them have tried over and over again to think about how are we earmarking our resources, and how are we being efficient in terms of how we run our programs, and how do we do that better so that we can we can save some money and invest it in other ways. There's a lot of interventions and thinking. Unfortunately, for the majority of countries as well, what we are likely going to see, and this has been the trend, is that sometimes the cost of healthcare is going to be pushed to the patient, and that's going to be the unfortunate reality. And so, while there's a lot of pros and cons around, health insurance schemes, there is also quite a lot of conversations that are brewing around, paying services to access services. And I think that is something that we are trying to avoid as much as possible. yes, some populations believe that they don't mind paying that 50 cents or whatever you want to call it, but that's not everybody's case and everybody's situation. We know that the majority are still going to be left out and will not be able to afford anything if they were to be asked to pay. So just to give you an overview of what's happening around the region and some of the conversations around that. Thank you.
Amanda, thank you. And they all have such comprehensive answers to really complex questions, right? Greater self-reliance is a huge thing to talk about because, and Fionnuala, I want to ask you this question. You know, for too long we have siloed the access to medicines movement, the progressive tax movement, the debt relief movement, and I feel now this is a time that we can really all come together because if we're really serious about unlocking capital, we have to be really serious about regional manufacturing. That means strengthening the health regulatory bodies. That means overcoming IP restrictions, but it also means unlocking debt and making sure that's trade, not aid. You know, so these are all very much interconnected. We have been in global health trying to douse out the fires that we've seen. We've all been in shock. We've all trying to get the numbers to kind of wrap our heads around what these foreign aid cuts mean. But what does it really mean now for true coalition building? Are we seeing that in the global health movement? How can we really bring people together to talk about these complex issues? And the next question I'm going to say is because one of our key asks as the Restore Humanity campaign is for Ireland to lead an emergency summit at the EU level to bring EU leaders together to think about these very complex things and to think about how our bloc can work with the Global South to try and unlock capital and allow for greater self-reliance. But how do we stop decolonize, like how do we decolonize global health through that? Because as a bloc, we have colonization almost in our bones. It's very much even within our trade system. So like how do we overcome that now? So these questions are probably interlinked. I don't know if the questions more than comments, but I hope that both of you can really take an overview of that. So we start with you, Fionnuala.
Thank you. If and when I have a chance to do my PhD, you've given me a few great questions for it there. But I'll try to say something vaguely intelligent and succinct. I think so. I mean, I think you're absolutely right on the coalition building, and this is what's happened at the health policy level. So Amanda mentioned the Lusaka agenda earlier, which is really all about, getting us out of these different disease silos and enabling countries to think about their health system and how it's financed holistically. And we haven't really caught up, and we're still, for the most part, working in our different spots, whether that's working on a particular area of health like I do, or whether it's working on access or health workforce or other issues. And I don't know how, but I think that we really need to rethink that quickly. And one of the things that we do within our movements is, we go to all these conferences where we meet all the people that work on the same things as us and agree with us. And actually now with a lot less money, I don't think we're going to be doing that so much. And maybe we need to capitalize on that, the fact that kind of constant echo chamber experience is going to be suspended a little bit. Can we capitalize on that and create something else, probably virtual? I would really want to see the drive for that. On the theme of decolonization, I'd really want to see the drive for that coming from the Global South, and people from the Global South really saying this is what it's about, and then people from the Global North add themselves on in a way that's useful but don't sort of dominate the decision making, because that's what happens. On the EU thing, I actually want to throw in a couple of points related to the EU from the earlier questions that were raised. And I think the first thing I want to say is that in one of the earlier letters that the Restore Humanity campaign sent to the DFA, you raised the issue of disinformation. And disinformation is playing such a critical part in everything that we're talking about here. It's feeding racist ideas, anti-immigration ideas, anti-Global South, anti-aid ideas. And then there's the horrendous layer of attacks on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and on sexual minorities as well. And these things all intersect. And to come back to your earlier question, Robbie, about how we bring different areas of health together. We need to bring the different rights and justice movements together as well. But Ireland will have the EU presidency imminently, and I think it's being increasingly recognised at the political level that disinformation is a major global security threat, and it's a big threat to Europe. And so I am hoping that we can do a bit more advocacy towards Ireland to use its presidency to take that issue on, which I think is such a core part of everything else that's happening. Then my understanding, and one other thing is that I think that global health is potentially, actually, somebody in the chat was talking about the example of the Netherlands and how the government there is saying that aid needs to be like self-serving and serve Dutch interests. And, you know, well, nowhere is that more true than in health, you know, and COVID has indisputably shown all of us that. And we have this mounting threat of antimicrobial resistance, which, you know, is something that will again affect all of us. And when you look at what we're going to have if the suspension of HIV treatment continues, you're going to have a lot of people with HIV drug resistance and TB drug resistance. And, you know, then you potentially have people developing superbugs and things as well. So there are, and those things are wrong for any one single person to go through that anywhere in the world is wrong, but it's also a health security threat for every one of us wherever we are in the world. So I think that there's real potential to use the lens of global health to demonstrate how aid investments are for everybody's benefit wherever we are in the world. And I think we're not doing so well in that. And again, people are still talking about all their own individual issues that they're paid to work on without thinking about what are the most strategic arguments. And this year, the EU is starting work on its multi-year financing framework, and that puts money into programs within Europe, programs in the EU neighbourhood, and then also humanitarian and development spending. So I think that there's scope to bring health security arguments into that and make a really strong case for bold European investment in health that meets everybody's needs and interests. How we decolonise Europe's approach to the rest of the world is a much bigger question. And I think that we're so, you know, because we've started to have discussions about that in the last 5 years, there are almost some people who are like, great, it's done now because we've had the discussion, whereas we're so incredibly far from that. And how a country like Ireland might go about it and what experiences we might bring to the table are very different from how, you know, the UK or France or, you know, any other former major colonial power might approach it. So, I mean, I think, again, it comes back to who drives the process, whose needs are the core indicators of whether the process has succeeded or not. But we can see with processes like the pandemic accord as well, how, you know, a discussion that was initially much more about access issues, you know, the access issues have been completely pushed out, and the end accord is much more about what the rich countries of the global north want. So I think even when you have a process that is driven in that way, it's the dangers of it being hijacked are huge. And maybe just a final word, which is that I think that while there's all this work going on around countries' self-reliance, what's also really interesting is to see the countries that are speaking out and standing up. And it'll be interesting to observe how that starts to play out in the multilateral spaces. And so again, when we think about, you know, when I think about like my colleagues who are based in our South Africa office, or like a partner of Frontline AIDS who's really strong, who's based in Kenya, like how can we be supporting the leadership of our colleagues and partners in these different countries to really support their governments in claiming their space and their voice in those big global political discussions? And, you know, how can we support that kind of rebalancing at the geopolitical level, whether that is in a discussion with the EU or whether it's in another multilateral space? And that's, I think, something that we all need to really work out Are we hindering that? Are we helping it? What do we put into it? And how do we tip away from, you're going into a global process, so you better hurry up and go and speak to Sweden. You know, it should be Kenya that you're speaking to, or South Africa or India. So yeah, feel like I've said too much. Thank you.
Not at all, Fionnuala. They're all excellent points and a lot of action points and thinking around what you've said. It's really fantastic for us to move forward. And Simon has his hand up. Maybe just a few more because we're out of time. Simon, you go ahead.
I do, just a very quick point, and just I agree with everything that Fionnuala said, but just there's one policy which a lot of people outside Europe haven't heard so much about, and it's called Global Gateway, and it's the EU's new policy. It's an initiative really, because it's not legally based on anything, but it's something that we have concerns about, that a lot of the EU's traditional development and humanitarian policy might be changed to something called Global Gateway, which is much more commercial in focus, and is an attempt to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm just going to paste on the chat just a part of the initiative which talks explicitly in a document that's available publicly about health technologies and what that new European approach would be in health technologies. So just bear in mind that this is from the European Commission and giving a very positive spin on their efforts within Global Gateway, but it talks about the Team Europe initiatives on manufacturing and access to vaccines, medicines, and health technologies, which is MAV+. So I'll put it on the chat, and I'll put the name of the document, and just so that we found that, say in my work, we found a lot of people in Africa and in other continents just aren't aware of Global Gateway and what a big deal it is in the EU, and in a sense how much of their traditional development policy they're trying to replace with this Global Gateway initiative. So I'm going to put it in here, and just for people who aren't aware of this, they'll have some reference. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Simon. Just to quickly wrap up, we're at 3 minutes over time, but still thank you all for still being with us. So for our two amazing speakers, we just wanted to ask you if there are 3 key points from your talks today that you would like us all to live with in order for us to be part of this change with actions. What would those be? So I'll start with you, Fionnuala.
And I'll try and be much quicker than I was before. I do think that point around Ireland's leadership on disinformation is really important, and I would really encourage the Restore Humanity campaign to really keep pushing on that. And I really want to help more as well. I think that working together to share knowledge and ideas and activism and impact during this time is really, really critical, more so than ever. And it's really important that we're not competing with each other as well. And I think that orienting whatever resources we have to support our partners in our civil society partners in the Global South to do the advocacy that they need to do is critical. And we must actually be really careful that we're not getting in the way or taking their time and resources to serve our needs. It's really all about putting our energies and our resources in there right now. Thanks. And keep going, everybody, because we've done a lot and we'll do a lot more, and don't give up.
That is such a fantastic way to end your talk, Fionnuala. So we'll come now to you, Amanda. What 3 things do you want us to run away with today?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that for me, I think Fionnuala has mentioned some of these already, but I think that we can challenge our governments. And I think I also like the leadership role that Ireland is going to take, because I think that's going to be really influential. And I think that we cannot underestimate one strong, powerful leadership in terms of how that potentially has the power to influence other leaders, especially in that EU. And I think that if we saw the EU sort of like coming out strongly and pushing back maybe on some of the narrative. And I know that some of the members are culprits already in terms of already making those decisions, but I think it's not too late to sort of like change, the narrative and the framing of foreign aid. And I think the collaboration and support and sort of like working together with civil society organizations and networks in the global south that are also pushing. I think this sort of like information like you just shared, I think something on the global gateway, I'd not heard about that. And I think I was mentioning, technology innovation is also going to be one of the key things that potentially, if done right and responsibly, could be a game changer, for the continent. And I think that if most countries are not aware of some of these things and the implication, like I mentioned earlier when I started, for a lot of our governments, they're hearing also quite a lot of the things from the media, which is distorted, and there's just not the right information and sort of like, what are those leverage points, that they could use to engage and gain traction in terms of what they're demanding and asking for in the global fora. And I think the last part for me is that how we all want to engage and get involved in terms of, bringing out the narrative that this is a win-win. And I think sometimes it's always seen as aid and these are the recipients and this is what they've gained. But I think that we need to also recognize that the US has gained a lot from these investments, if not more than the continent has gained. I mean, just look at the health workforce. I've worked on health workforce quite a lot. And I think that 300,000 plus healthcare workers have been impacted and have lost their jobs as a result of these cuts. But guess what? I'm not going to be surprised to see a migration of a lot of those healthcare workers moving to the EU where there's a big shortage. And I think we need to really work on framing the narrative that it's a win-win solution and it's not just a give and take, but that everybody benefits at the end of the day. And I think we can reconfigure how that is done, but it's no longer the charity model, but it's the win-win, and that everybody stands to gain out of what's been happening. And that visibility to that hidden narrative needs to come out more strongly. Thank you.
Well, we could not be ending this webinar on a very strong note. We do thank you, Amanda, Funula, and all our participants for joining us. What is clear from what we've discussed today is that we can't really reverse the clock that started. It's already started thinking, but there is a massive opportunity here for each and every one of us, our governments, our leaders, to change the narrative, to change the story of what is happening, to move the power dynamics and, make the donor and the recipient countries to be equal partners on this table. And the pathways that we really explored today stands to change this over-reliance on the funding and for us to start reimagining how we can support, as Patrick said, a skill development, of this community to be able to explore their own capacity and capability to be able to stand at the decision making table. So we do thank you all for even staying 10 minutes past the time. Once again, we thank our speakers. We hope to engage with you more. There are links in the chat for you to join this campaign. It's all about action. We just can't be talking about this anymore. We all need to take a stand and joining, initiatives just like this humanity campaign. It's a big step for you to be part of that decision-making process that can switch this power dynamics between the global north and the global south. So once again, on behalf of everybody at Irish Global Health Network, we are so thankful and we hope to see you guys soon. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Amanda.